right, welcome to another Chris and Rick Talk Guitars. That's Chris over there.
Hello there.
I'm Rick. Our previous episode, we talked about Japanese guitars, and it's a huge topic, and we love to talk about it and rant about it. So we decided to do a part two. Chris had some good insights to bring to part two with regard to Japanese guitars. Chris, why don't you kind of get us rolling on what you're thinking
my idea
for part two?
I just generally said that it might be good to talk about how the big American companies dealt with it. You know, last time we talked about a lot of the copy era and the first original designs from Japan. We might talk a little bit more today about how Fender and Gibson and whoever else dealt with the Japanese companies, as it applies to that. If you can't beat them, join them.
Cool.
That was my idea.
I like it. So
let's roll with that.
Why don't you pick a big one? I mean, do you want to pick either Gibson or Fender to start with?
Well, I guess we should start with Gibson because I think they were the first one where they kind of took the Epiphone brand and sent it over there.
Yeah.
And we could just break for a moment to talk about, like, one of the things that's kind of funny is in that, like, viral Gibson video, they talk about brand dilution. This is a classic example of self-brand dilution, because if you look at all those beautiful Epiphones first when they were owned by the original company, beautiful arch-top guitars, and then Gibson bought them, and they made really great Gibson. They were very similar to the Gibsons, but, you know, they were great guitars. I think the problem was they were almost so good that there wasn't enough separation, so Gibson decided to just kind of, like, send Epiphone to Japan and, you know, make it its own thing and hit a different market. But that was the point where really you cheapened the brand name, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And that's like kind of a classic example in my mind of brand dilution.
Because
to this day, think about it. If you went out right now and got in like a 1960s beautiful Epiphone Casino, like what the Beatles used, and you get up and you play that, you're going to feel great about it because it's a really awesome, classic, well-made guitar.
Yeah.
But, you know, from a superficial brand level, somebody sitting out in the audience is like, oh, he's playing an Epiphone. So it's like, you know, it lost its, you know, it may sound superficial, but at the same time, there's power in that, you know, like knowing that, you know, all this history and stuff behind this name. Now it's diluted. It's like it could be a Japanese Epiphone, it could be a Korean Epiphone, it could be a Chinese Epiphone. It doesn't really mean what it used to be. The label does.
I hear you.
And that was, and I apologize for that sidetrack. It just popped into my mind. But in 1970 or so, that's when Gibson decided to send it over to Asia, send the Epiphone label, and so they started building them. Some of those designs were, you know, based on, you know, classic, you know, USA Epiphone models, maybe with little twists like a bolt neck or something like that, and some of them were completely original designs. And when they really got serious, probably right around the time that Fender did, sometime in the 80s, where they wanted to have more of the Japanese market. So they started the Orville by Gibson company.
Got it.
Or label.
Yeah.
You know, which was made by, you know, I'm going to get in over my head. It might have been Fuji Gen that made them. And those are really great guitars.
Yeah.
The deal with those are they're exact copies of the USA, like Les Pauls, SGs and whatnot. They have USA pickups. They have nitrocellulose lacquer, and the logo is really cool. Have you ever seen one?
No.
The logo is just, it looks almost like Gibson. From a distance, it looks like Gibson, but it says Orville.
Oh, cool.
And then underneath it says by Gibson, and it's the same font, and it's inlaid. Nice. Really nice guitars, and that was for the Japanese market alone, so we didn't really see those guitars here. Now you can, because it's a worldwide market where you can see just about anything. Those are cool. And they also made the Orville, which was like a level down, and it might have even been later, which was kind of the same guitar, but it didn't have lacquer and USA pickups. There's some really nice guitars, but there's also some lower end guitars that are just okay. So that's what Gibson was doing. I'm trying to think of anything else interesting that they would have been doing with Japan at that time as far as trying to open up any other markets. The Epiphone, what did they do with... Epiphone has a pretty interesting post-'70s history, too, because there was a time in like the early 80s, like around 83 or so, where for some reason Gibson said, let's try to build Epiphones here for a little bit. And for 1 year, they made, I think it was at least 2 models. It was an Epiphone Spirit and an Epiphone Special. And the Epiphone Spirit was kind of like a Les Paul Special shaped, but it had arch top, humbuckers, a wraparound bridge. Really cool guitars. It's exactly... I mean, it's all made like a Gibson. It's like,
cool.
It's exactly like a Gibson, but it says Epiphone, and it's got a very unique one-time only Epiphone logo. Those are really cool guitars. You'll see those from time to time. The Special was kind of the same deal, but it was an SG shape. And I have a story about one of those Specials. Back when I was working in a guitar store, and I was selling guitars. At this time, I wasn't working so much as repairs, which I ended up doing later on, but I was a horrible salesperson. Other than I could bullshit with people and help them find guitars that fit them, and I liked doing that. But this guitar came in on consignment, which was one of those Epiphone Specials that I never even heard. I knew nothing of this brand, but I picked it up, and I'm like, this is a great guitar, and it happened to be belong to the actor who played Punky Brewster on Punky Brewster,
really?
So it was like a star guitar.
But a child star guitar.
The people in the shop laughed at me because I sold that guitar for $450, and they were just freaking out like, how did you get that much for an Epiphone? But it was a really great guitar. I actually wish I would have gotten that guitar. And the person that I sold that guitar to was a parent of a kid who wanted to get a good first guitar, and they were looking at all these other guitars, and they were just like, kind of like crappy starter guitars, and they didn't play very well. And I steered them over to this. I'm like, this is a great guitar. It's got one pickup, blah, blah. It's very simple. And they took my word for it. But like a couple of days later, they came back and they wanted to return it because it didn't have enough pickups. It didn't have enough tones. And I should have just taken it back and stuck it off the side and got it myself. And I don't remember if they took it back, but the thing of it is if they kept it, I think it would be so great, because if that person would have gone on to play guitar, it would have been cool saying, wow, my dad got me this really cool, somewhat rare...
Was it P90s?
Or no, it was one humbucker.
Oh, okay. But
it was just, you just pick it up, and it's a great... It's like a good Gibson SG.
Yeah, for sure.
And I mean, all we had around at that time were those, the shitty Korean Epiphone, that... And I shouldn't say shitty, okay.
So was that Gibson's attempt to kind of bring the Epiphones back to America and see what they could do? It,
I really don't know what the reason was. They only did it for about a year, and it didn't work. And what they did, so they shifted. The only thing they did when they said this Epiphone isn't working, maybe it's the name, they put Gibson back on the headstock. The same exact guitars. So you can find those guitars that either say Epiphone or Gibson, and they're exactly the same. And they're really cool, no frills guitars. You used to be able to get them for $300, $400, $500. Now they're probably close to like $8 at the minimum. Dang. Maybe up to like $12 or something. Great guitars. I mean, for the money. I mean, for a vintage style guitar. And that was one big sidetrack. What was I talking about?
Well, we were talking about kind of, you can't beat them, join them.
Oh, yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So Gibson, with the Epiphones, they sent them overseas to be made in Japan. And like you were saying, it is interesting to see how they diluted the brand, where you've got these American-made ones that, like you're saying, the casinos and stuff that the Beatles played, and which are really cool guitars, and then these later models that were built in other places that aren't as good. So it is interesting to see how they were kind of trying to negotiate this whole, Japanese infusion, into the market. The Yamahas and the Ibanez were great guitars.
They got there eventually.
Not just the copies, but the models that they built themselves.
Exactly. But at the time, the stuff that Epiphone was making for Gibson was just all right.
Yeah.
In the first 70s, they had some. I remember they had like a hollow body, red hollow body guitar that was pretty popular. You saw a lot of them.
I remember that too.
That was a really crappy guitar. It had a bolt-on neck. It was really clunky. Really hard to set up. I wasn't a fan of that guitar at all. And, and the bolt-on that I had too was a decent guitar, but it wasn't as good as the later Japanese guitars and even the later Epiphones, because around the mid 80s, there, I think even the early 80s, there were some Epiphones that were made in the Matsumoto factory that were really cool. They made some casinos that were great. And they made them for the Japanese market first, and then early 80s they brought some of them over here, and you can see those from time to time, and those are really great. Those are cool. Better than any of the the Epiphones that non-Japanese Epiphones later. But the very early ones were just okay, and then they got better. and they did the Orville and the Orville by Gibson guitars, which were great. So that's all Gibson was doing. They're playing in these markets over in Japan, trying out things and bringing stuff over here. And then Fender, which kind of did the same thing. They were getting hammered. I mean, there was one company in particular, Greco, that was making these Fender copies that were just like really great guitars and very, kind of reasonably priced. So they were getting hammered by those. And when they went to start Fender Japan, they went over there and they actually got the company that was making those to make them for Fender. And that pretty much killed the Japanese copy market because, if you have a choice, I want this really great Japanese guitar or this really great Japanese guitar, the same guitar, but it says Fender on it, or, Squier by Fender on it. You're going to go for that probably. The brand does have some power over there.
Oh, totally.
Over there. So, and you talk about brand dilution with them, in a way, Fender was kind of a little bit worse. I don't want to say that word because it's not, it seems more negative than it is, but they flat out said, Gibson said, you can't get a Gibson unless you buy something from the USA.
Right.
You can get a Fender that, from Japan.
Yeah.
So that's kind of, it's interesting that, they went that far with the name. When they started, it was just Squier. They were, they were, actually, the very first ones said Fender, I think, Fender by Squier, and they changed that. I don't remember. And I don't remember for sure, but yeah.
Well, I think it was kind of smart because, like you're saying, you could buy a Japanese copy, but as we know, you talk to these people from Europe or Japan, and their mindset is they see these people, their heroes playing a Gibson or a Fender, and that's what they want. Just like other people in America seeing their heroes play these guitars. So, you had prominent players coming up in Europe and Japan wanting these guitars. So to me, it seems smart that Fender said, "Hey, we're going to brand these Fender because we know." And again, like as you and I know, we'll look for these Japanese guitars throughout, the various time periods, and they're great guitars. Like, these Japanese Strats and Tellys and all these models are great guitars. They're built well. They're, attention to detail, all that other stuff. And so a lot of these reissues too that are Japanese made are just, you see them in stores and they're great guitars and people love them. So, yeah, I think it was smart for them to do that, really.
But in a way, what's really interesting when you talk about brand dilution is they even diluted the Squier brand, because the 80s Squiers were fantastic guitars. Mm-hmm. The first Squiers were great, and they go for, some of those are $1,200 to $1,500 for some of those early JV Squier guitars, and now you have the cheapest guitar you can buy is a Squier. So it's there you are again. You just but brand is only one thing. I know. A good guitar is a good guitar.
Yeah.
And it's, and it seems pretty superficial to be all brandy, but when you're into classic guitars, it means something, it's a vibe that,
Well, and again, these companies, as we talked about before, they've earned their place in the market, Fender and Gibson. They're two of the pioneers of electric guitars or guitars in general. And so, within the guitar world, those are the two main brands that people love, and for good reason. They've had their ups and downs in terms of quality control and all this other stuff because they've been around so long. But I just think it's fascinating that these foreign markets were building copies and building great guitars that of their own models, and then really lighting a fire under Gibson and Fender to try to do something to compete with that.
And what they did was they just said, you make them.
Exactly.
Go ahead. And we'll just, we'll license you and you make them, and then we'll just kind of knock you out at the knees for the other one.
Yeah, which is kind of interesting. And I'm just wondering if you saw any signs in either company in the American side of things that improved as a result of having to compete with these other, rather than them embracing these other, manufacturers and stuff in Japan and stuff. Or I'm just, can you cite any, from the 80s and 90s?
If I understand what you're asking is, and I think I mentioned this last time, is with the reissue program, the Japanese did better with the reissue program right out the gate, and it caused the American company to kind of reevaluate the way that they were doing them, and they kind of tightened things up. So that was one way. And it's interesting because it's so confusing when you start talking Japanese guitars, because You know, you have the wholesaler, which, you know, and then the label, which may be the wholesaler, and then the different factories, because there were there wasn't just one factory that was making Fender Japan guitars. Right. The initial one was Fuji Gen, I believe. And if you see a Fender guitar that says made in Japan, those are from the Fuji Gen factory, and that's who made Grecos and a bunch of other really great non-Fender, like Fender knockoffs. And then later, when they hit the crafted in Japan guitars, there were two other factories that were making it. It was like Dyna and Terada or something like that. I don't know. So it gets really confusing paying all this attention to all these. So they're actually different guitars, really, because they're made in different factories with different tools and whatnot. Yeah. But they're good. Yeah. But some people will really key in on the first ones and go, those are the great ones. Yeah. That's where all the early Squires and stuff were made too. So it's really it's kind of fascinating, but it's a little bit. I mean, there's a lot of info out there, and it's kind of confusing. Yeah. And I don't know if I was answering a question or.
Oh well, I was just wondering, like, because I'm trying to rack my brain, because I know that for Gibson, for instance, under the tutelage of that CEO they had for 20 years, that was just really, in my mind, and I think in your mind too, really did a lot to damage the brand, rather than just focus on quality and you know, pillars of their models. You know, he chose to like do all these crazy things like the Firebird X, as we've talked about, and, you know, robo tuners and all this other crap. And I just think, like, it would have been cool if this foreign competition would have really just lit a fire under them to say, you know what, let's get back to the stuff that made us one of the big players in guitars, you know, rather than trying to go off in this other direction. And
no, I think they did that. I mean, it's right around the 80s, right around that time. I think both Fender and Gibson, and probably any other large company, kind of, that's where they took stock and said, you know what, people really want our old things. Yeah. So they tightened it up. But when you talk about the Firebird X and all this other weird crap, it's just like trying to open up and reach different markets and like innovate for innovation's sake. Yeah. I mean, anybody who really like has any knowledge of guitars probably realizes that, you know, that's not what a guitar is. It's not. A guitar isn't designed to be the newest kind of. It's like there's, you know, sounds you get out of it that are classic, and if you stick with the classics, you're never going to do no wrong. But I mean, people will try to innovate, and they'll try to come up with different things, and some of it will be okay, and maybe people will adopt it for a while. But for the most part, it's like, I mean, we're like old classic, like set in our ways things. But I do think, to answer your question, I do think that right around that time, in the 80s, is when both Fender, Gibson, and I think Martin and whoever, they said, wait a minute, people are buying our old stuff. Let's reevaluate. And that's when you started to see reissue programs by these companies. So that was all their focus. And it's interesting because these, both of, at least with Gibson and Fender, they made their reissues, it evolved into something else, the custom shop. So and it's like you pointed out, it's like, okay, this is a custom shop. We're going to make things like we should be making them anyway, but we're going to charge you for that. Yeah. And, you know, I haven't worked my inflation calculator to see if it's like it worked out to be like a legitimate way to charge for those things, because from the beginning, you know, things were way more handmade. Yeah. And then, you know, I don't know.
But I think that's a good point. I think the reissue stuff was really a reaction to that in a lot of ways, and just them seeing that these old models that they had, there was a lot of interest in them, right? I mean, and, you know, and again, even further back, I mean, in the 60s when they first came out with the Standard, and then they weren't selling any of them, so they didn't make them. But then there, in the late 60s, it's like, wow, people want, like you said, they wanted the Burst, but they actually issued the gold top Standard, but kind of missed it a little bit. But at least they were trying to meet that demand.
Right, they knew that, like, hey man, people want these. Exactly. So they were at least trying to do something. It took them forever to get it right. Yeah. Like, because it's kind of a pain in the ass, because you have to like think about it and look at them. That's why, you know, Fender was like the company that when they did their reissue program, that kind of set the standards for that, because they actually flew somewhere where there was a massive amount of old instruments, and like took measurements and, you know, documented stuff, bought a few of them, took them back, and they based their reissued instruments on actual, you know, instruments, instead of Gibson going, okay, it's a Les Paul, we got that template, we'll make, you know, a Les Paul shape, we'll put this on here, and we'll use the wrong neck angle and the wrong pickups and the wrong bridge, but, you know, it looks like a Les Paul. So that definitely, and I don't know if Japan was as much responsible. Right around the same time that was happening. I mean, Japan is responsible in the way that they were making old style guitars, like 50s and 60s versions in the 70s.
Yeah.
And when the other companies had wandered away. But Japan was super important to Fender when they went, around that time, because Fender for a while only had Japan producing guitars. And I remember, it's very interesting. I remember being in Marshall Music in Lansing, Michigan, and walking through there like when the new guitars were out, and there wasn't one new USA instrument in there. And the shop owner wasn't sure if there would ever be, USA instruments again. I don't know.
Isn't that crazy?
So I walked out of thinking like, wow, man, because I had a USA Strat, and I'm thinking this is going to be valuable because they're not making them anymore. But I'm going to find out it was just a short while.
Yeah.
And during that time they were still working on their USA reissues too. But Japan was their lifeline back then in the early 80s.
Well, and that's a great point. I mean, that's how important that they became in the guitar manufacturing business. I mean, it's insane to think that, but that's a pretty huge deal.
Oh yeah.
I mean, not only, kind of to harken back to the first part of this Japanese guitar series, they've kind of played an important role in guitar manufacturing for a long time, and served different purposes for guitar players at different times, right? Like we talked about before, it's like you could get an affordable Japanese guitar that was kind of your gateway guitar to, Fender Strat or a Gibson Les Paul. And then there's also just the fact that they were manufacturing their own models of guitars that were kick-ass guitars, just beautiful guitars, and top-notch players or world-renowned players were playing them, And so, it's cool to see that kind of they played this different roles, like in lighting a fire under the ass of these companies, and then also really competing with them head-to-head as guitar manufacturers.
And then being their lifeline, and then being part of them, being partners. Yeah. So and one thing that I tend to forget about is what talking about the end of like Japan, like making the standard Stratocaster, let's say, is like it's hard to think, but the made in Mexico standard Stratocaster was the replacement for the made in Japan standard Stratocaster, and that was they were designed to hit the same exact price point, and to because once they started getting that, they stopped doing the Japan standard. And I tend to forget. I just think of it as its own thing. It's like you have the made in Mexico Strat and the made in Japan, but they're supposed to be the same thing. And I think the made in Japans were a little bit better, but I think that they eventually caught up with the made in Mexico.
Yeah.
So one thing that I don't really have that much knowledge about, but I'd be interested in is like what happened with Gretsch.
Yeah.
I remember they went through the Baldwin period in the 70s,
right.
And I don't know if right after that they just kind of tanked and Japan bought them or what. But now Japan is Gretsch now, and it has been since sometime in the 90s, right?
Well, doesn't Fender own Gretsch, or does Gretsch own Fender? There's some relationship.
Maybe they
there.
do. Maybe they do. But I'm just like, See,
we'll have to do some research on that.
Yeah.
But that's interesting too, because Gretsch is another American guitar company that has been around forever, and their early guitars are funky too. Actually,
their early ones are cool. The Baldwin era is the really funky one. That's where they have the weird BST, like the bolt-on, and just the little really funky thing. That was kind of like Gibson's Norlin era,
right?
Where they did some really funky, and some of that stuff is cool.
Yeah, I think so too.
But
it'd be interesting. We'll do some research on that, and maybe we'll fold that into an episode.
And what do you think of Japan today? Like, what are they doing today? I mean, they're making tons of guitars.
Yeah, they're making Ibanez, signature models, and they're still making the SB, whatever they are, the SG,
the Yamaha stuff. There's a lot of that coming from Japan. They've switched a lot of those companies. Switched a lot. That used to be just Japan only. Now they'll do like Korea. And Taiwan, maybe.
Yeah, that's true.
China, whatnot. I don't know.
That seems to be just the way things go, right? But still, I mean, it seems like there's a booming Japanese market for guitars, and still, gateway guitars as well to buy.
Yeah, well, for gateway guitars now, I mean, the stuff that's coming out of China is so good for the money that you can get. It's really hard. I mean, get a Squier, one of the vintage modifier, whatever the hell they call them. I mean, you have so many choices now for gateway guitars.
Yeah.
And both Gibson and Fender are still plugging away at trying to make affordable things, which I think is really noble.
Yeah.
I mean, look at the Gibson's 2019 release. There's a million, not a million. There's 4 billion guitars on there. There's a lot of like options for for a decent USA made guitar that if you compare inflation wise was not available. Back in the day, not as many. And people will say that all the time, and it cracks me up about like Gibson being so expensive. Like they're like this guitar is like $1,000, and it's like that's not that much money
not for a new guitar,
a USA guitar.
And like you're saying, based on their manufacturing process and the way they build these guitars, it's kind of the nature of how they manufacture these guitars, set necks, all that stuff.
And there's so many Fenders you can get for dirt cheap. Like the Mexican line has tons of great models.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know if there's anything else we could, the Japanese guitar is like a huge subject.
It is. I'm sure
20
we'll talk
parts,
about it
but I don't know if there's anything else we need to touch upon.
I don't think so. I think it was really, it's just cool to see how, the if you can't beat them, join them thing was happening with Fender and Gibson, and how they were wrestling with this, this big competition from Japan, and
right. And I think they learned a lot with them about like, I mentioned like how the Japanese would market, they would have tiers of, model line. Yeah. And I think I think they took a little bit of that, and that's why there's so many choices now, like here for, here's your $200 Strat, here's your $350 Strat, here's your $500 Strat, here's your $1,200 Strat.
That's a good point.
And that's, I don't know if that's directly related to the old tiered system in Japan.
It might be. It might have had an influence on them.
It's definitely a thing. And I think though, really, I don't know that much about classic marketing, but I think there's always some sort of a system for hitting different parts of the market. But it's really interesting the way that Japan did it. Like, if you can download an old catalog, like a Greco catalog or something, and just look, you'll see 3 Les Pauls. Yeah. And, the 500, 600, 700. And just like what they have, if you can read Japanese, you can see all the features that as you go up, you get better. So. Yeah,
well, it's interesting because like, back in the day, Gibson had like student models, or even Fender did too. They had student models, but it's a good point. I didn't think about it until you said that, is like, you really didn't see that kind of diversity in models until about that time, the Japanese infusion. Like, you had the Les Paul Jr., you had the Special. They were less, expensive.
They were different guitars.
But now you've got like, with Fender, like you're saying, you've got all these different tiers of a Strat you can get.
The same basic guitar. So it's like the same amount of pickup, the same switches. It's a Strat. But it's this level and it's this level. And, some of that is done by, like, country of origin where they're created. You can shave off some. And as you go up, the quality gets better and better. Yeah. So
that's kind of a cool observation. And it stands to reason. Because, I mean, yeah.
I don't know, man.
Well, sounds good to me, man.
I love Japanese guitars.
They're cool.
USA guitars.
I love guitars.
Yep, exactly.
Me too. Well, cool, man. That was a great convo. I'm sure we're gonna weave in more Japanese guitar stuff someday. But until then, thanks for listening. We totally appreciate it. Check us out on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. Chris, you got anything to say?
Thank you for listening, as always, and have a great summer.
Cool. Yes, have a great summer, and we'll see you next time.